Morning, everyone. And I'd like to start off by thanking GreenCape and the City of Cape Town for hosting this very important topic on public-private collaborations for basic service delivery around energy, water and sanitation, and waste. We've got a fantastic panel today. I'm not going to go through all the bios. They're listed in the conference background. But just to introduce Leon Grobler, who's the Director of Rollout Environmental, Janine Rebello, who's the CEO of Think Wi-Fi, Gerard Pina, who's the Deputy Head of the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, and Nava Narain, the Anglo-American Senior Social and Development Manager. And we've got about 45 minutes for this panel discussion, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. To have a more engaged final 15 minutes of the session. Yesterday at this conference, a lot of the sessions looked at what needs to be done around the service delivery sectors of energy, water and sanitation and waste. Today's sessions are really about how it gets done, and can better relationships between the public sector and the private sector contribute to rolling out service delivery, particularly in poor and vulnerable areas. It's obviously closely linked to the next session, and that's relationships with communities. We can't really divorce how the public sector engages with the private sector and how the public sector engages with communities, and for that matter, how business engages with communities and vice versa. So these two sessions this morning are closely linked. So welcome everyone in our audience. Welcome to the panelists, and I'd like to kick off with just from your experience in the field, and all of you have got a huge amount of experience in the various fields. Just to give some examples of successful partnerships between the public sector and the private sector, either the formal PPPs, public-private partnerships, or any other types of collaborations. And Nava, perhaps could you kick off there, please?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Andrew. And good morning to the panelists as well as to our audience. Thank you for having me. So, Andrew, from my experience being in the mining industry, it's always been very challenging to have formal private collaboration. And in the mining industry, what we've attempted to do is go into MOUs with the municipalities. For example, some of the projects we have initiated in mining has been in the health sector. We have developed a number of clinics and hospitals. And as you know, in order to actually deliver on a project of that magnitude, you need to have a very close relationship with the Department of Health, because we would go in, we will build the infrastructure, but the actual maintenance and servicing of that project and that clinic or hospital to the communities then needs to become the responsibility of the health department. So we work very closely in collaborative partnerships in order to ensure that actually happens. The other projects that we have implemented in our communities is, for example, in the waste and sewage departments. As you know, a lot of mining companies are surrounded by a lot of informal settlements, and they do not have access to normal sewage systems, which meant that we need to then, in collaborative partnerships with municipalities, develop sewer systems that could service these communities in the informal settlements, etc. We've gone, and these were all in MOUs, each one playing a partnership role, bringing their portion to the project, as well as we delivering infrastructure projects. Or another nice example is capacity building projects.
That's enough. I'm going to stop you there, so we'll come back to you. Yeah,
thank you.
Janine, any examples from your side on effective collaborations?
Andrew, thank you for that. Good morning, and good morning everyone that's on the webinar and my fellow panelists. So yes, we've had a couple actually of successful collaborations, and I've got to echo what Nava says, that formal engagements are particularly difficult, and I think for us at Think Wi-Fi, because we have a very different commercial model. There's no commercials changing hands. We often find that the public partners don't know how to deal with us, because we don't fit into a formal commercial agreement. But where it has been very effective was the two song centres, was the government communication and information system department, where we have worked with them to identify government service centres across the country. There's 181 of them, and we're able to then, in partnership with them, roll out free Wi-Fi and infrastructure across these government service centres. We actually started the first one in Ograbis, of all places, Northern Cape, where we found there was very little communications infrastructure available to the community. So it gave life to that government service centre, and it provided much needed digital access to all government services there. The commercial model itself, the way that our company works, is that it's advertising funded. So it was meeting government KPIs. It was also meeting our needs, and it certainly was meeting the needs of our customers, being the brands and the community. So we had a triple win, or a win-win-win situation there. So MOUs seem to be very effective. We've also done the same with Western Cape. We've rolled out some infrastructure and some informal settlements and underserved areas in Western Cape. And must say, Western Cape government have been really, really supportive, and collaborating with them, especially where we would perhaps need access to some infrastructure or that type of thing. So yes, I think MOUs far more effective in my experience.
Great, thanks, Janine. Gerard, what has been your experience?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. Good morning, everybody. So from our side, as Andrea said, I'm from the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, or SECO, for those of you that have worked with us before. We're quite a small donor. So from SECO's side as well, when we involve with economic development and cooperation, we work through partnerships. And those with our multilateral organizations, such as the World Bank or the IFC, etc., UNIDO in some cases, or some of our bilateral partners. We also have partnerships with government specifically, and in selected cases with private sector directly. So I'm going to give you a few examples. One is the City Support Program, where we've partnered with the National Treasury already since 2017 through a trust fund agreement that we have with the World Bank to provide support to the 8 metros in the country. And we've covered a lot of aspects with those trust funds, including economic development, so the subnational doing business kind of work that you might be familiar with. We've looked at public finance, we've looked at infrastructure financing, transport, human settlements, etc. Currently, we've expanded that partnership to also look at resilience, which is, I think, very relevant to the conversation today. But it is technical assistance, so we don't really go from our side towards the project implementation side. We enable the metros to do that. Just the good example of the City Support Program is, at the moment, there are about 13 partners already that have, through MOUs or MOAs, partnered with the program, with a value of over 100 million rand to strengthen the capacities of the cities. The other one is with the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, where we really look at project pipeline development and upstream support, with the idea to go into project implementation in with the cities, which could lead to PPPs. So a lot of the challenges that we already see with PPPs are coming through that specific program. Two more examples, just very quickly. In the Ilembe district in KwaZulu-Natal, we've started already in 2015 with a local economic development program. And this is where we really see on the ground how to work with private sector, whether it's in the infrastructure space or whether it's more on strengthening the private sector and their operation in the area. And that was really done through a project agreement, which is a legal requirement between our National Treasury and ourselves, but then with a series of memorandum of understanding or agreement between the three municipalities, Ilembe, KwaZulu, Mandini, and then with the Provincial Department of KwaZulu-Natal of Economic Development. So that one is really good. We see some good results coming from that one at the moment. Just to a more complex partnership with the Inca Municipal Debt Fund. It's a new fund.
Last example.
I'll be quick. On that one is specifically to look at credit enhancement. So that's a bit more of a formal, complex partnership that we've been dealing with the last 4 years to set up. We'll launch it within the next month or two, but that is really to provide funding for municipalities around their infrastructure programs. So you can see our partnerships really range from very loose and flexible towards very complex and legally grounded. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Gerard. Wonderful examples. And last input, Leon, your experience of effective and successful collaborations.
Thank you. Thank you for the panelists and the audience. Thank you for the opportunity. Andrew, yes, being in the waste industry for 30 years, you know, now there was obviously a few success stories as far as collaborations and service agreements are, but you know, the one that spring to mind is where we had one of the metropolitans where we were actually creating a cooperative, and we're building, you know, facilities in the communities to actually do recycling projects for them, you know. So that is just one that quickly spring to mind. There's a lot of other, you know, in the processes where for the development of landfill facilities, but I think I would like to discuss that as we go along, you know, in our PPP discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. So what I'm hearing from all of you is that in most cases the formal and legalistic side is quite challenging, but there are opportunities if it's done in a sense more lightly or more informally through an MOA or an MOU to get things done with public authorities. And I think I'd like to a little bit later on come to some of the specific barriers and obstacles you have come across in your experience in putting together these partnerships. Maybe just a word on a comment on this word partnership, because it can be applied to everything and therefore mean nothing. And in my experience, certainly it's quite important to differentiate between different types of relationships. You can get consultative relationships, you get transactional relationships, and you get collaborative relationships, and they're related, but they're not necessarily the same. So you consult with your stakeholders, and that's citizen engagement and participation and information, and that's vital. And obviously the private sector needs to do that as well. And then there's service level agreements, which are kind of one-way relationships between client and contractor, someone delivering on your behalf, service providing on your behalf. And then there's partners. It's a third category where you have kind of mutual accountability, shared risk and reward, and a kind of two-way relationship. And I think that sometimes public authorities don't quite know what they're looking for, that sort of service provider model, or a stakeholder engagement model, or a partnering model. And we always like to use the verb partnering rather than partnership, which is the noun, the structure which should follow the action. But let's I'd like to perhaps just do another round, and maybe just very quickly, in your experience, I mean, why are these partnerships and collaborations so important? Why do we go to all the time and effort and sometimes hair pulling and frustration to put these things together? And maybe Janine, why don't you kick off?
Thanks, Andrew. So I think they are a lot of work. You're quite right. I mean, and that's because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of people involved. But certainly, I think one of the underlying reasons is that once a collaboration or partnership or whatever form it takes is in place, it's very, very effective. It's very powerful. You know, it's perhaps misguided, or you know, it's difficult to believe or think that government's capable of, you know, we tend to think that government should be delivering all public goods, all services. And I think they do to the best of their ability. But when we get the private sector involved and partner together, and we're bringing those resources and expertise and diverse thinking into the mix, I think government gives us a very stable sort of platform to work from in terms of engaging with the wider set of stakeholders. And it allows private business to do what they do best, which is agile rollout and different commercial models. So yes, it is difficult, but necessarily so, because there's a lot of governance involved. There's got to be the assurance of partners being treated with, the equal opportunity, et cetera, But I think the overall effect that we can have, bringing, that governance that the public sector would have, together with the agility and the commercial thinking that private sector has, certainly is a powerful proponent of change.
Thanks, Janine. Yeah, I agree with that. The combination between the authorizing environment of government, what you call governance, and the more responsive and agile rollout of private sector is a good combination if you can get it right. Leon, why are partnerships important?
Andrew, thank you. Yes, being in the waste industry for 30 years, I've seen that, the processes takes extremely long. If you go into a permitting process, you'll be going anything from 4 to 5 years to permit a new landfill. Then thereafter construction starts, that's another 2 years, and then the operation starts. So from the moment you basically initialize the project, it will be 5, 6, 7 years before the project can actually be initialized. My experience in the market was that over that years, officials come and go, and if the project is not sustainable, and I think Gerard talked about diligence, really had to have diligence in this process to actually keep on going, because sometimes people go and then the project, I won't say need to start up all over again, but you really need to start all over with new officials and try and take off where you actually stopped. So from my side, the partnerships is very important when it comes to waste, because the diligence of managing landfill facilities, and I think waste facilities in this country, we've seen that the state of our facilities, of our waste facilities in this country, is in a terrible state. So it is because people come and go. And for me, those partnerships are important, that you actually get established, experienced people that can run them and maintain them. Because when I do, sometimes I do training, I always I compare a landfill with a house, and the only one difference is that the house, when you do something wrong, you can break a brick down and start over again. But with a landfill, if you do something wrong, it takes you years to fix it. So for me, in those sense, partnerships and collaborations going forward in waste is definitely very important, because the service level agreements that we get from municipalities and treasury, you see, is 3 years. With the expense of landfill compactors and equipment nowadays, you cannot actually, it's not affordable. A new landfill compactor nowadays will cost you 7.5 million rand. And you try to depreciate or buy that for a service level agreement of 3 years. It makes disposal extremely expensive. So from my side, collaboration in the waste side, is a definite must.
Sure. So Leon, you're talking about the need for a long-term outlook rather than shorter-term 3-year contracts, a degree of patience and tenacity to stay involved and sustain this, and the need for a degree of capacity and capabilities for partnering on all sides. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult. Gerard, your view? Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. I want to link up to what Leon has said. It's really about what is the end game here. What are you working towards? And I think, the patience and the tenacity comes from keeping that in mind. We, as a donor, have to look at efficiencies, for example, and that's where partnerships become very important. It's efficiencies in terms of capacity, human resources, especially financial, where there are big programs, and as a donor, you can sometimes just carry a small part of that. So your partners become very important to reach the end game in the end. For donors, I think there are also, especially in South Africa, there are a few principles that guide our involvement in the sector. And I think that goes also for partnerships then in general. That's value add. Where do we add value in that partnership? It's about risk taking. Who takes the risk at what time of the project cycle? And is that legally bound or grounded? Is it well thought through? Is it well understood? And I think those are some of the challenges that we will get in a bit later. And it's also about capacity building. Partnerships need to learn from it. The partners need to learn from each other. And I think that's an important part, especially when we work with municipalities or government, to see what skills transfer and what capacity building approaches we do instill in those programs. I think just lastly, to understand these partnerships, municipal officials, donors, partners need to understand what are the mandates, who are the role players, do a proper mapping, do your due diligence to understand what are we up to when we enter into that partnership and how can these parties then contribute to that specific partnership. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Gerard. Just emphasizing the need for a two-way relationship rather than a one-way relationship there between the partners. Nava, why do you get involved in partnerships? Why are they so important?
Thanks, Andrew. So just to dovetail off what Gerard said, for us in mining, our communities hold the social license to operate or the social license to innovate. So for us, if there's no partnerships, it will end up with risks to our operation in terms of protest actions, where we would be stopped in terms of operating. So for us, partnerships, as Gerard said, it's skills transfer, it's to empower communities so they become part of our value chain, and we make the impact that they require, whether it's in the education, health, service delivery, waste, whichever type of space that we are required to make that impact. So you unfortunately, private sector needs to understand we cannot operate in a community unless we're in a partnership due to resources, due to capacity and capacitating our own communities so they become better equipped to take advantage of opportunities. So Andrew, there's huge opportunities to collaborate. It's difficult, as Janine has indicated, but we have to put our shoulders to the grindstone and actually work with it. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Nava. I think you're saying that there's no option but to partner or work together. It's not negotiable. Just to add to some of the insights that you've all put on the table, I think that right now in the COVID post-pandemic phase, we see the increasing fiscal crisis of the state. And now more than ever, government, given its shortage of resources, inability to fill posts, the reduction in intergovernmental transfers to municipalities, it's all going to severely affect service delivery, more so than any time in the last 25 years. And I think now more than ever, successful collaborations between different sectors of society, what we call whole of society approach, is essential. I would just add one other thing here is that when you're dealing with complex societal problems and complex economic and developmental challenges, it's very seldom that one party on their own can solve those challenges, whether it's the government or the private sector on its own or the community on its own. And by acting together, you can deliver some sort of collective impact, but you can also deliver a better solution to a complex problem with more buy-in, and therefore it becomes more sustainable. And I think that one of the themes of this conference is innovation. And we've certainly found out that innovation tends not to come from within an big institution on its own, whether it's a big corporate or whether it's a public sector institution or even an NGO. It's when you juxtapose the different cultures and the different approaches and the different needs together, sometimes that in-between space, if it's structured properly, can drive innovation. And that's certainly another motivation I've come across for partnerships. So I think, as all of you have alluded to, these things don't always work. There are a lot of challenges and barriers and problems. Gerard, what are 2 or 3 things that you've come across that really inhibit collaboration?
Thank you, Andrew. I'll focus on 3. There are a lot, as you probably know. I think for us, the main thing at the moment is talking specifically about your more complex partnerships is the alignment of legislation. So there are a couple of reviews going on at the moment. Your PPP regulations, the borrowing regulations, the MFMA is being reviewed. So looking at this process is quite important to also open the environment for innovation. And so not to be too strict on supply chain management and procurement, for example, but still maintain your checks and balances. I mean, we need to understand that the legislation is there for a purpose. You know, we cannot just scrap it and do what we want. I think so a lot of the international partners are really trying to get to grips with the PPP regulations and to see how, especially as an international finance institution, can partner with local communities or municipalities around these instruments and still meet the legislative requirements. So that is normally quite a big thing. The other one is on cost. Coming from an international environment, the costs are quite important. It is expensive, especially if you want to work with international DFIs. And there specifically, if you have to come into a tender procedure then with the South African environment, which, as I said, is also very competitive and needs to be, but there are loopholes, and to see how we can actually reduce the cost and through what mechanisms we have to work then to become involved in the municipal infrastructure space, for example, which adds to the complexity of the partners. I think for us, the third problem is really to see how the partners at different spheres of government work together. And we see it in the water sector, for example, where the mandates are split between spheres of government and the relationship there is not always good. So maybe the district delivery model will work on that. We know it's already complex, not sure, but there's definitely something that needs to be looked at. And maybe just first, Andreas, is really on community participation. You alluded to that. You know, community participation is required, but we see a lot of municipalities, especially your undercapacitated municipalities, use this as a tick box exercise without really consulting with the communities and understanding what kind of delivery models will work best in that municipality. And we've had some serious issues in some of our municipalities around, for example, business fora that have not been part of the conversation and then start making demands that block infrastructure projects, for example, which is quite a huge problem. We know that at national level there is an awareness of the problem and being looked at, but it is stopping implementation in some of our projects as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerard. It's a good list. Tough ones to tackle. Leon, your experience of what are the problems and obstacles? Just a couple.
Andrew, thank you. You know, I think in the waste industry, you know, we're not dealing with a sexy product. You know, we're dealing with waste. You know, and sometimes it's very difficult for people to accept that waste is a liability and that we need to deal with waste as we go along. So my experience, I've been involved in 2 specific PPPs for 16 years. You know, the one started up with an MOU for a waste to energy facility. You know, and we went through the entire process and we've obtained a license in the Western Cape for the first waste to energy plant in South Africa for a municipality. You know, and after 12 years, you know, the municipality turned around and said, well, because of public outcry and we can no longer proceed with this project. You know, so the project basically just died. You know, the second one, and in this scenario, that's where the public actually, the sector, you know, climbed out of the project. The other one is where the private sector climbed out of the program, because this was for a landfill facilities in the Southern Cape where we've been going on for 6 years. You know, we got a donor funding. We've been going along. We were about to reach financial close on this project, and then obviously COVID starts, and then at that point in time, you know, the private party just felt that it can no longer proceed, and it climbed out after 6 years, you know. So, and it is literally on the day or the month before the financial close documents were supposed to be reached. So we've been pulling the municipality along for 6 years, and the municipality's been pulling the private party along for 12 years. And at the end of the day, we couldn't get to financial close and reach finality. So it's, for me, there must be a better way that we can actually get into bed together and actually commit. It's like a marriage. If you get into a PPP, you must marry with each other, and you must know that when you get out, there's consequences. But in this scenarios, there were no consequences. People just literally walked away from the project after a 10 and a 6 year period. So and there was a real need for these both these projects. The one in the Southern Cape, they were really depending on this project to start. So for me, it is just too easy to walk away after a long period of time, getting the commitments, getting the finance, signing on the dotted line, and before you sign it, so sorry, I no longer want to be involved, and walk away. You left the other party high and dry. So for me, that is a serious problem. I mean, we need to find solutions to commit, and get these projects over the line.
Thanks, Leon. I mean, I think that two issues you're raising there, the need for accountability in these processes to each other, as well as to communities that need to benefit from the outcomes of these partnerships, and building respectful relationships based on hopefully an element of trust. Because if there's a toxic relationship or a disrespect in the relationship, and one party can renege or cancel or walk away, that's not good. And I think we perhaps need to come back to that. Nava, your experience of some of the blockages in the mining sector, in the mining belt, I'm sure it's tough challenges that you started off mentioning.
Thanks, Andrew. And, just to echo what you're saying, it starts off with trust and the reluctance of certain parties that come into this partnership to actually deliver in terms of that trusted relationship. We've had experiences where we would have one partner, as Leon said, that would walk away from a project, and you then left to deliver this project to the communities because it's something that is so critical to them. And the other challenge you would have is communities would expect, there's an expectation that they would then be empowered, in terms of these projects. And you know what, mining wants to empower local host communities. But what happens is that they may not necessarily have the necessary skills or competencies, or be able to be competitive in the supply chain space to take advantage of these opportunities. So the other one is, in terms of technical competencies, you would find our engineers would manage projects, and they would not want to risk their engineering certification being compromised by community entrepreneurships that can't deliver to the expected standard or the governance, etc. So there's a number of challenges, but how committed are you when you come into this partnership? How driven are you to make a difference to society and to the communities that these projects need to be delivered to? I think those are the critical questions one need to ask when you come into these partnerships. Thanks, Andrew.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Nava. Janine? Your experience of the obstacles or your challenges and difficulties.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I've got to echo what Gerard said, that the legislative requirements are there, and for good reason, but they certainly add a good deal of complexity, and also introduce extended timelines. So we're a fairly small company, and we've been going now for 2.5 years. So we've actually, in terms of barriers, I think we actually steer away where we can from formal PPE engagements, because they're just too onerous. The commercials on them take too long, and just the speed at which we move as a tech company, there's just a misalignment really with our operations and the way that the process on the PPE side is structured. So it actually has to a large degree prevented us. These difficulties and challenges have prevented us from pursuing a formal relationship at that level with government. As I said before, it's far more effective to collaborate and maybe look at an MOU. The other thing that we found as well, that we have become sort of embroiled in one or two instances in infighting and politics between various departments. I mean, I guess in one way it's good because it's very competitive and everybody wants to achieve. But it also has the potential to destroy or delay projects. We've seen it between different areas within a sector, so perhaps between the mayoral office and Metro. And we've also then seen it within different departments, so let's say an IT department that wasn't involved. And that's in this instance, we were ready to roll out infrastructure last October or September. And that project has been absolutely stunted due to the just lack of alignment internally. So that definitely is another barrier.
Wow. Okay. So lots of interesting stuff coming through there. I see there's one question from the audience, which we will get to the other questions that have come through in a couple of minutes. But comment from the audience, it would be great to hear an example of a success story. Okay. I mean, I think some have already been put on the table, but maybe I can just, Gerard, you and I think Janine, you also alluded to the problems of split mandates, or what I'd call fragmented governance in the public sector system, which can lead to non-collaborative behaviors and, Janine, as you say, infighting between departments, wanting to either claim the glory or saying, don't touch me on my mandate, or don't bring me your unfunded mandate, and it can go round and round and round. And I mean, as a rule of thumb, firstly, we've found to get successful whole of society collaboration going, you first need the public sector to focus on whole of government. And if a divided government arrives and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or the left hand is trying to chop off the right hand, these collaborations with the private sector or the community sector or academics and researchers usually don't work, because those sectors don't have the time to sit in endless meetings waiting for government to sort itself out and walk away quite quickly. And that's sort of one of the problems here. I'm also, Janine, just from your point, I'm not aware of any successful PPPs in terms of the formal legislation in this country in the last 5 years. And someone I know did a quick calculation that if everything goes well, it takes a minimum of 4 years to get it approved. And again, private sector, especially smaller companies, don't have that time and energy and resources to go at risk into those sorts of things without some sort of compensation. It just doesn't work. Perhaps we need to come back to that. Just on perhaps an example of a success story and related, Gerard, to this issue of intergovernmental collaboration, and I think you mentioned the water sector in particular. Cape Town and Western Cape emerged a couple of years ago from a terrifying drought over 3 years, and the Western Cape water supply system is a complex system in that part of the mandate is national, part is provincial, and part is local. And then there's different users: agriculture, the urban users, the big city uses the water, the small municipalities right up to Saldanha all also use the water. So for that member of the audience, there's an example of a success story. We have a collaboration between national, provincial, and local government in water, together with agriculture and industry, around doing a hydroeconomic study of the Western Cape water supply system, with a view to getting better information and intelligence on how the system can be better governed in future, from catchment management and clearance right through to decisions around whether you do alternative supplies like desal or underground and things like that. So there are examples, if you put your mind to it, that you can organize collaboration. So I'd like to come to our last round with everyone on the panel, and then we're going to, and if you can, panel members can start looking at some of the questions that are coming through. What you've got a moment to effect change, and I'd like you to recommend what changes you would like to make or like to see in terms of making it easier for public-private collaborations to occur. Nava, do you want to kick off on that one? Just some recommendations for change.
I think firstly, as Janine alluded to, if you're going into a partnership with municipalities, government, we need to have all the stakeholders in the room, that they're all aligned to the different projects that we want to implement. I also think there needs to be a close working relationship between traditional authority and the municipalities, because often that causes huge discrepancies and almost a tug of war in the communities that projects need to be implemented in. Also, when the stakeholders come together, there must be this openness to trust, to build that relationship, and to actually learn from each other. That means, as alluded by the other panelists earlier on, that we learn from each other and we transfer the competencies between all of us, and keeping our eye on the goal in terms of actually achieving the objectives of those projects. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Nava. I mean, I think, just to respond to your 3 points there, getting, I would say, not just all the stakeholders in the room, but the right stakeholders. If you try and get all the people together for all the issues in the community, it sometimes goes nowhere because it becomes too complicated. So if you get the right stakeholders for a particular issue together, that helps to focus and concentrate the minds. Alignment of, I've had the experience of endless discussions about, are we all aligned to the common vision or reimagining the future? And, you know, often people have different versions of the future, and in a democracy, that's fine. But can you perhaps narrow it down to a common agenda, 2 or 3 things that we can work together despite differences, and then shifting dialogue into joint action as quickly as possible, because communities can't eat visions and MOUs and things like that. They need action.
Exactly.
And, you know, translating those dialogue sessions into action as quickly as possible is what does the trick in my experience. Leon. Recommendations for change.
Sorry, Andrew. Yes, thank you very much. You know, I think from the experience, the amount of monies that was paid by the private sector to get these projects to the line or over the line, you know, was quite enormous. You know, because in the one PPP, the private party was actually mandated to go and find the funding. The funding was found. You know, it's around about 200 million rand, and the 200 million rand was obviously needed to be secured with contracts. And it took 2 years, 24 months, to get 26 contracts drafted with the best lawyers in Gauteng. You know, and at the end of the day, when this project was not actually reached financial close, you know, basically at that stage there was 12 million rand down the drain. You know, and unfortunately in this scenario, the private party walked away from it because of financial situation that they found them in. But in the first one, where the public party walked away, you know, it took, like I said, 12 years to get this waste to energy license, 12 million rand further, you know, and then once you got this license in your hand, you can do nothing with it because, you know, of the public outcry and the public. So for me, it is like you say, commitment, and it's not like there was a bad relationship in both of these. There were actually very good relationships in these. But, you know, sometimes councils and boards of private companies, you know, they need to understand the commitments, the risks. As a project manager sitting there doing these deals, putting it together, speaking to the community, speaking to the officials, the departments, all those type of things. It's a real commitment, and you're building credibility with it. And if you just by the click of a pen just basically drop the process, you literally, you're left in the dark, and it's very easy for a council and for a board to say, well, we no longer want it because of the public outcry or our financial crisis. What is the alternatives? How can we make this work? So for me, people should be accountable, from day one. The current PPP regulations, until you reach financial close, there's nothing. The moment you sign the last document, the PPP document, there's commitment. But until that point, you could have 26 contracts of a meter high, but you haven't reached, financial close. You basically lost. So for me, we need to look into see how we can commit and how do we actually change that people can't just easily walk away without consequence. For me, that is the biggest. And then obviously the need for the project is still there.
Yeah, I'm going to stop you there. I'm watching our time very religiously here, and I'd like to just bring in Janine, your recommendations for change. Sorry, Leon, I'm just going to keep the time open for questions as well. Janine?
Thanks, Andrew. So, if we, as a country, if we've stated that digital transformation, the IR4, is important, and we know that economic growth and empowering and supporting small businesses is important, and that's one of the fundamental elements for the success and continuation of economic growth, then we can only conclude that the current PPE process is not aligned, right? I'd like to suggest that perhaps government would like to review that, and perhaps it should be reviewed, at a more, at a higher administrative level, to be more supportive of the agility that we need in the digital age and the digital economy, and answering the questions of how do young, innovative, creative entrepreneurs and or small businesses, how do they participate in a way that's commercially meaningful for them, and how do we take away some of these prohibitive barriers? Because I think until we do, it's going to be other small startups like ourselves that will avoid formal engagement and look for other ways of engaging, perhaps. And the pity is that if we could get around this, we could certainly, as I said, in my first question, form a powerful alliance. And we closely follow the Sustainability Development Goals set up by the UN, adopted by South African government, and we actively track 5 of them: eradication of poverty, equality to access to education, and diminishing inequalities in terms of access to resources. So, looking at how, and we're already tracking those, we already incorporate those goals as part of our day-to-day operations, sustainable communities, rolling out solar-powered lights, rolling out digital infrastructure and access to online content. How can we work with government in a way that is more agile, that is more aligned to the fourth industrial revolution, and is more aligned to a small business? If we can get that right, I think certainly we can go forward very quickly.
I think you're raising the very important point, is how does the public sector create a more enabling environment for either community initiatives and NGO initiatives, as well as private sector initiatives to help support the development goals? And firstly, that means public sector has got to let go that they are the only ones that do service delivery, that sort of notion that's where it starts and ends. And secondly, my experience, not all, but many public authorities tend to be inwardly and upwardly focused to political parties and the Auditor General around regulatory compliance, rather than downwards and outwards focus to the non-government sectors, private sector, community sector, and we need to switch that around. Gerard, your recommendations for change. And then Nava, could you take that one question around the question 5 from the audience, please? Gerard.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got 3 points. One is one of the models. Well, I'll speak to it from a public sector point of view. So coming from the other side of the coin. First of all, I think as metros or as municipalities, there's a way to go to clean up the house, and that can be done through transversal management or matrix management. How do teams within a municipality work together on programs? So not to have isolated projects and working in silos, but really work across teams around some of the, for example, infrastructure projects or informal settlements projects that we are seeing. It is a model that we started piloting in some of the metros through the city support program, but it's still a long way to go to see how to capacitate the municipalities. And the model really looks at structure, productivity, it looks at team accountability, it looks at relationship management, it looks at collaborative leadership. And as I said, there's a lot of the cities are still struggling with keeping the teams accountable, which is, I think, is one thing of improvement. The other one is, how do we as cities learn from each other through peer learning or knowledge management, communities of practice? You know, and that comes with a risk. Communities of practice takes time and it takes resources to drive that. But it's a great way of cities to learn from each other as well. And how do we deal with PPPs? How do we deal with working with the private sector? Linking to peer learning is also knowledge management within a metro or within a municipality. I did see the question around how do we deal with project champions that leave the municipality, that might leave a gap, specifically in that trust relationship then with the project partners or with the community. That needs to be linked to a process of institutionalization and also cross-functional processes within a municipality to make sure that that institutional memory stays, whether the political environment change or whether the administrative staff or project managers in a municipality change. So definitely careful consideration needs to be given to that. Lastly is really communication and dialogue. Andrew, you've also mentioned the dialogue. It's ongoing dialogue with your partners, but it's also frequent and updated communication with your communities that you work in. Communities need to know what is going on, who deliver the projects, what is the end game? You know, what do we want to achieve? And modern technology and Janine knows it with Wi-Fi work as well. There's a lot of technology options available at the moment to reach out to communities and to get that loop of information between a metro and the community. And I think we really need to give some more attention on how those processes work and how can we harness that to provide information real time to the metro or the municipality. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Gerard, and thanks to all 4 panelists for brilliant insights and suggestions of where we need to focus on, in a sense, changing the system to make it more enabling of collaboration and partnering and achieving collective impact. Gerard, I think you've also touched on question 6 from the audience, which was about municipal departments in large metros and in many other municipalities operating in silos, and to the extent that this has hindered your ability to create valuable partnerships and effective stakeholder engagement. 100% it does. If departments are not willing to work together on a common cause, it really messes up any partnering arrangements and effective community engagement. It's whether it's transversal within an institution or intergovernmental between the spheres of government, or in fact cross-boundary with neighboring municipalities cooperating, because sometimes the problem spills out over political and administrative boundaries. So you need transversal, you need intergovernmental, you need cross-boundary action. And often officials and politicians they struggle to move from the boundaries that they've created around their particular portfolios and mandates and budgets and projects. And one has to spend quite a bit of time working within the public sector to make them partnering ready and fit for purpose for collaboration. Nava, there was a question around to serve communities in informal settlements more fluidly, more flexibly on the ground, to respond to situations as they happen rather than a few years in the future. What kind of partnership is best suited for this? What would your answer be to that?
Andrew, so from experience, we've gone through, I think, a long journey in terms of understanding how we partner with informal settlements and the communities that make up these informal settlements. And what we found is that a very effective community engagement structure is the kind of vehicle that you're going to need to partner with the communities. But in saying that, this community engagement structures need to be very formally agreed to. They need to have a terms of reference that governs it. They need to be certain responsibilities from the different stakeholders that are part of this engagement forums. And it should not only be business forums that form part of these forums. It should be NGOs, it should be municipal, ward councillors, traditional authorities, etc. Each one bringing their responsibility to that forum. So when issues that do emerge on the ground, they can be quite effectively and very quickly addressed, because you have different, as you said, Andrew, the right stakeholders forming that part or being part of that engagement forum. So, we've trialed and we've tested this from having open allocation of individuals onto these forums to eventually leaving the people that are nominated to these forums in the hands of the communities, people that they trust. And we've come a long way, a long journey in terms of formalizing these partnerships to become effective. So that's my suggestion in my humble experience.
Yeah, thanks for that hard-earned experience, Nava, and for those insights. So there's another question from the audience. With the long lead time for large-scale interventions, can we explore other targeted interventions on a smaller scale targeted at specific communities? I would say yes. You need to get some action going, even if it's on some short-term issues, because the best way to build trust is to build it in action. You can talk and talk and talk, but if nothing happens in the short term, people get discouraged. And so while you're working on the bigger and the longer term and the more complex issues, which take time to bed down, do some things together at a smaller scale, targeting specific communities. It builds that trust in action. That works time and time again. There's a second question from the audience. What role, very interesting one, what role does institutional memory, in other words, the ability of an organization to continue operation despite employees changing, and I would add that politicians also change from every 5 years, how does this affect partnerships on a short and long term, and how can this be improved? And maybe just because we've got literally 2 minutes left, if I can answer it on behalf of everyone here, my experience when I was running the Cape Town partnership, we dealt with the changes to 8 mayors in the years that I was there. And the point is that when you're in a partnership with a public sector institution, the partnership carries the memory over the electoral cycles and the changes in officials more effectively than sometimes in the institution itself. And that's another good motivation for having partnerships, which can keep the traditions going rather than reinventing the wheel every time you have a regime change through an election or officials coming and going and a new HOD or a new executive director coming in and sweeping clean and wanting to reinvent everything again. So I think we just have time to really thank the panel, Leon, Janine, Gerard, Nava, thank the organizers of this, and I hope that we can translate a lot of these ideas into action after this conference by working together. Tracy, back to you. Thank you.